surprising.
We
Wish I
always
could
have
say the same.
Yeah, I know.
Chat GPT as backup.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
ChatGPT can just replace me on the podcast.
It can replace all of us. That's eventually what it's going to do, especially with the auto GPTs.
I'm just going to give it a prompt. Be witty and entertaining. And it better be good enough to go from there, because I don't have a better prompt.
I'll give it a prompt, be dull and drab.
Yeah, we need some contrast.
I just won't prompt it.
Hallucinate incredibly. Maximum hallucinations, as they call them.
Pretend you're on 6 different drugs and then do a podcast.
Yeah. Do a podcast as Joe Rogan after you just did hit a molly.
And snorted a fucking 3 lines of coke.
All right, and with that, we're live. So today we're going to be tackling the topic of the space race. So obviously there was the initial one between the Soviets and the States, and now we're entering a new one that's quite distinct in the sense that it's not just countries going at it, but also companies. So we'll start off today with Price. You want to give us kind of a little bit of an overview of like where the countries are at in terms of a space race in the 21st century?
Yeah, so I've seen articles arguing that there's more people involved in the space race now, more countries going at it. But it seems like the big players are a union of China and Russia, where China provides all the technical know-how and Russia puts stuff into space, because Russia's been putting stuff into space for 30 years very reliably. And until SpaceX came along, they had the best launch systems in the world, arguably, definitely the cheapest. And the Chinese have their own space station orbiting the Earth, and they want to get more. And their big plan is to have a Chinese-Russian base on the moon by 2027. And to counter that, the NASA plan is to have a base on the moon by the end of the 2020s. But the interesting thing with NASA is that they aren't as government-oriented. They're looking more at using the private sector, which is exploding in terms of space travel. So they will be using SpaceX's Starship in order to go to the moon. And that will be supposed to be on 2026 and 2027. But anything with space travel is like the ability to forecast the date is quite difficult. And what they want to do up there is basically build a base. There's more information on the American base than Chinese base, probably because the Americans are subcontracting so much to private companies. They need to know the scope. But they want a pipeline that will transport oxygen gas from a mine, an autonomous mine on the moon, and it will transport it to the base station. And the reason it's a pipeline rather than trying to just truck it is because the moon dust is incredible. And they also need to figure out roads and stuff for the same reason that you can't just go driving on the moon. It fucks a bunch of stuff up. So a pipeline is the logical solution for how to get oxygen gas from the oxygen-rich mining area to the base camp space that they want. And they will also have 3D printing, a lot of 3D printed cement. So they gave a sample of moon dust to a cement 3D printing company that's already built a lot of projects for the U.S. Army and other people who want 3D printed cement on Earth. And they basically asked that company to figure out how to make cement out of moon dust. And the company sounds like they figured it out. So they're going to be in charge of building the actual buildings that comprise the base camp. And that oxygen gas and those buildings should kind of be the baseline infrastructure to keep manned missions to the moon going. And then they'll be able to stay at base camp for up to 5 days. Out of the Starship will be 5 days. Then base camp will allow for even longer missions than 5 days. And the Starship, the reason it can do 5 days as opposed to, the old landings, if you've seen them, where they just go onto the moon, kind of walk about and head off, is that the Starship can carry 100-ton payload, which is basically unheard of in terms of the ability to transport things in space. So I think when I was looking into countries, that's the big that would be like the goal as the space race between countries, is that moon base. And then you have the European Space Agency that wants a mission to explore the moons of Jupiter, and a couple other missions like that are being launched because the moons of Jupiter are now considered very likely to harbor life, or one of the most likely areas in the solar system to harbor life. Maybe not very likely. So that is a place for the scientific endeavor, but for the bragging rights, I think the moon base is the goal.
A part of the moon base is also like there's potential for the disruption of like enemy communications and whatnot down on Earth. Like that was one of the things I read. Like if you set up a base there, you can cause quite a bit of mischief with like interfering with other countries. Like it seems like denial of communications is the biggest one of that. So it also has like pretty strategic use in that sense.
Did they say, is that because of the lack of atmosphere allowing radio waves, or what?
They didn't get too much deeper into it. They didn't. But
it sounds really odd to me why you would go all the way to the moon to disrupt things that could be done from Earth.
Price lasers. Haven't you ever seen Austin Powers?
Yeah, that's what it sounded like to me. It's sort of an Austin Powers plot.
Unless you give us $1 million.
An interesting aspect with the moon is that the countries are legally not allowed to claim land on the moon. So it could get weird if two countries wanted a base camp in the same place and they both beg these big missions to go there, and then one gets there first and presumably has the rights to be there, but legally they actually don't. They just got there first, but they don't know the land. It's like,
why don't they
hopefully somebody figures something out.
Yeah, well, I figured it out. You fly up a Native American, the Native American makes the land claim, then you fly up the white settlers, and then you easy.
It's actually all the native land. It's all treaty territory.
Exactly.
I'm sorry.
Then it becomes part of the UN UNDRIP. Under the native land treaties, and then you buy it off the natives, lease it for 10 million years or whatever. This is actually
like we just throw a band on a starship and drop them off.
It's actually just too easy. Did you mention India? Because pretty sure India has like some aspirations that are.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't read too much about India other than the fact that they are on the precipice of human spaceflight. It's supposed to happen this year. I didn't see any confirmation that it was happening this year. But they've been launching a lot of satellites, and India seems most competitive in sort of the private sector from what I saw, where they have a lot of startups that are claiming to be able to offer rates that would be competitive with, say, SpaceX. But and their government's trying to get stuff into space, but I don't know if they'll. It seems like they're too far behind to really be competing for a moon base at this point. So they're just kind of burgeoning space power.
Aspirational.
Yeah. They do launch a lot of stuff into space, and they're coming up in the world. Like it wouldn't be surprising if they came into like a European space organization level or something, but NASA is really the big name combined with all the American companies, and then of course the Russians are the Russians, and China's China. So I don't know that India's going to reach that level.
Well, they might, but it'll take them probably another 20 years to get to a point.
And India just fundamentally is the hardest country to get a read on because everyone's been saying they should blow up and be like an economic juggernaut for probably 40 years at least.
Well, yeah, it does take. They made progress. It doesn't happen overnight. So
yeah,
maybe it's coming. Is there any other countries or do we want to cover, or should we talk about the billionaire space race?
I think we move to the billionaires because there's a few more players. Well, there were a few more players in that game, although there seems to be a clear winner now.
Yeah, so I can cover kind of the main entrance into the billionaire space race. I think it was like a lot more in the news, say 10 years ago or even 15 years ago, when all of these companies were like founded and started, making their goals and their milestones that they wanted to reach known. And I guess the three big ones were SpaceX and Virgin Galactic and what's the Amazon Blue
Origin.
Blue Origin. Those are like the three, I think, most notable ones. And
it sounds like there's been a couple spin-offs that aren't billionaires as well, and like the idea of corporate private stuff, right?
Yeah, there's definitely aside from like essentially like billionaire founder led ones, there's definitely been more like actual smaller ventures that are in the area as well. Like there's Space Adventures, which is like a tourism one, but they don't have any of their own rocketry. They just they always use Roscosmos, which is the Russian space agency or space company that does all the launches, and they just offered space tourism for a long time, but just on the Russian rockets, on the Russian.
Piggyback the Russians.
Yeah, as far as I know, there's not a lot of like actual original rocket development in terms of like the billionaire situation.
Okay.
And again, so I think Blue Origin was the first. It was founded in 2000, and then Virgin Galactic was 2004, and SpaceX was 2001. So it's all around that same time that they kind of got into the game together. And I guess probably worth going through from like saddest attempts to most successful, and like Virgin Galactic is definitely just not inspiring, in at least from what I could tell, because their plan, basically their plan went from like space travel and being like this leading company to like sending something that got to space without exploding. And the basic design concept they had was they retrofitted an old like regular jet, and then they had a launch vessel, so they would fly up this plane like this. I think it was like a old 747 retrofitted, and they would fly it up to like as high as they could get, and then they'd launch another like smaller vessel out of it to try to get it into space. And they had one that exploded.
Sheesh, I didn't even hear about that one.
And killed the co-pilot and injured the pilot. It was like in 2014. It was like a test.
Yeah.
Of this smaller craft getting launched at a larger one. And then in 2021, they actually had the new version that they developed had a successful flight, and it was 2 pilots and 6 crew members, and they got past the 86.1 or the 80 kilometer ceiling that's considered space usually. I don't.
Yeah,
it's kind of like
it's an arbitrary line, and it was very. It sounded like a lot of people were just like, I mean, technically you got into space, but really, like, you just flew a plane really high.
I think it's like basically escaping the gravitational kind of feelings. It's something to do with that, but it's more or less arbitrary. And yes, they made it so the aircraft made it to 86.1 kilometers above Earth, which did crack the ceiling, and they were there for a little while and then came back down. And that's the last thing that's really happened on that front. Not really that exciting. Because it isn't even really rocketry. It's just mostly flying up.
Yeah, it's a plane. So
plane. Well, I think there is
rockets on the plane. I'd imagine they do if they're that high.
Yeah, I think that's what they use for the secondary craft. But yeah, it's not very exciting. So the second one is Blue Origin. I don't know why I want to say Origin Blue, but Blue Origin, which is Jeff Bezos's baby, and their game plan or goal was just to like have incremental progress towards space flight. So they just like get something that could go up successfully, safely, suborbital flight, and then get into an orbital flight. They have one launch vehicle that's been developed. It's called the New Shepard, and it's fully reusable suborbital rocket. and they've actually had successful flights with this thing, and it goes past the 80-kilometer. It's called the Karman line, that 80-kilometer barrier. It's gone past that, and they've actually brought crew and passengers up to that height. And basically, what it allows is a few minutes of weightlessness in space, I guess, and then it comes back down, and that's about all it does. So you get to go up for about 10 minutes and come back down. You get to feel weightless and like you're in space. And so far, they've collected $50 million in revenue from selling tickets to do this. And some of like the more notable, I guess the most notable person that people would recognize is William Shatner did that flight, because I don't know if people remember him going to space while it was on the New Shepard. That was his way that he got into space. And Jeff Bezos has also gone on one of them, and I think his brother as well. So yeah, they've actually made it to space repeatedly, and seems pretty reliably. And they do have plans for a larger launch vehicle, but that doesn't seem to be very far along in the actual process. I don't think they don't have anything fully constructed, let alone tested and launched. But they do have plans for something bigger and more powerful in the future.
Another plan I saw of theirs that's interesting and commercially oriented is they want to create a private low Earth orbit space station that'll hold 10 people. And that'll be a luxury hotel.
I was going to say, what was the economic purpose of that?
Yeah. So
charge rich people lots of money, I would assume.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be super rich people will be hanging out on a space station, and it'll be a vibe, I'd imagine. It wasn't clear how they were actually intending to build this luxury hotel, but by the sounds of your statement on their larger craft being under development still, I'd imagine they'll probably have to launch the parts of the hotel into low Earth orbit with SpaceX or somebody else if they want to get it done anytime soon.
I know that's been Bezos's dream since he was a high school student, is building space hotels.
Well, he was talking apparently about how his long-term vision for humanity's future is orbiting stations that hold up to 1 million people each. I was like, it's not quite Mars, but it's pretty ambitious.
Sounds very fun, living in a space station. 15-minute city, starting to sound not so bad.
The problem with the space station is when I was looking at this, to deal with the effects of low gravity, even to travel to Mars would be incredibly difficult because you have to work out 3 or 4 hours a day to maintain. Well, you actually still get muscle and skeletal degradation working out 3 or 4 hours a day. And so the trip to Mars would be pretty rough, even working out 3 to 4 hours a day. But living on a space station, I don't know. They must have a plan to have artificial gravity on those space stations, because otherwise you'd just be screwed.
You'd just never come down.
Yeah, actually, that's a common sci-fi trope, I guess. You have Spacians who can't handle the gravity of a planet, and they just live in space their whole life in sci-fi.
Yeah, so I think Blue Origin is like a moderate success. They've actually made some money, and they've actually gone multiple times into quote-unquote space, but not anything that exciting. And then the last company, SpaceX, obviously much more exciting. They developed a launch system called Falcon 1. That was their first craft, and that was...
I heard the best anecdote about this. Sorry if you were going to share it, but where they made 4 Falcon 1s, right? That was the one?
No.
Oh, sorry.
You go for it.
Well, their first rocket, maybe I just don't know the name, but their first rocket that they were going to proof of concept actually test fly, they had 3 that failed to launch, and then they had a 4th one that they had to fly to location on a plane. And it started, when they started descending the plane, it started buckling, and an engineer had to like get inside the rocket and release pressure, or I guess what had happened is it expanded and released pressure, and then as it came down, the atmosphere started crumpling a vitally important part that could have exploded the rocket inside the plane. So an engineer had to release that valve so it could allow atmosphere inside the vessel. And basically the entire success of SpaceX, that was their last rocket, and if that didn't work, they would have went bankrupt. And then that rocket was like proof of concept, and it flew properly as intended. And this one engineer basically saved the lives of the whole crew on the plane and the fortunes of SpaceX by crawling in there and figuring out how to stop the problem that was causing it to potentially explode.
Yeah, I do recall they had a successful flight, which led to big money from NASA. Basically, they got contracts, which was I think they got almost $400 million from NASA after showing proof of concept, essentially, for their basically NASA paying them to potentially to bring things into space using the new rockets. So yeah, that saved their company essentially as the funding from NASA, which was contingent on them successfully demonstrating their capabilities. And I guess further, they got a further 1.6 billion after that demonstration. So yeah, a couple $1 billion worth of funding that saved the company because they were teetering for sure. Yeah, so I think Falcon 1 didn't do much of note. It had a couple of successful launches, basically showing that they could make it to space and bring stuff there. And then they came out with the Falcon 9, which was larger, a newer design, and that one has been like the astounding success. Yeah, it's astounding success. I think if you include all of the various different launches, like reusable launches, full send launches, like where they don't recover any of the parts, it's done over 220 flights, and it's had one partial failure and one total failure, but the rest have been successful. And that's been so they've been flying the Falcon 9 since 2010, and they also have so that, I guess it's worth noting, like for terminology's sake, there's the rocket, which is what actually provides the thrust and brings the stuff up into space, and then there's the whatever capsule or cargo container that you attach to it, which is different. So like, I guess the classic example would be that people think about is the space shuttle. That was like what you attach to the rockets. So those are the NASA had five separate space shuttles that were of similar design, and that's the iconic white
strapped to an orange rocket.
Yeah, that's what everyone thinks about is the shuttles. And so that SpaceX also has a container, the Dragon. They have several variations, but the Dragon C2 capsule, which can bring crew and cargo into space. And yeah, I don't know, like we could go over the litany of successes and various milestones that they've achieved, but like it's just a crazy amount of different things that they've brought crew to the space station, International Space Station. They've delivered a ton of gear to the space station, done a lot of flights to restock the International Space Station. They've brought up a ton of satellite and other equipment into space, including I don't know the exact number, but it's thousands of satellites for the Starlink.
I can find that exact number. Well, actually, I can't find the exact number, but as of January, I think it was around 13,000. But then they had regulatory approval or they're seeking regulatory approval to get up to 40,000, because they have to go through the United States every country has jurisdiction over what's launched from it. So they have to get approval from the United States to launch these satellites. And yeah, it was 13,000 last time I saw, or the most recent one I saw. Which, to give a context, until SpaceX started launching satellite or Starlink, there had been 8,500 human objects launched into space. Full stop. So there are more Starlink satellites than there are anything else in space launched by humans.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. Like, I'm just, you're just looking through the different accomplishments. Like 2012, SpaceX became the first commercial spacecraft to deliver cargo to the International Space Station. There'd never been commercial craft. In 2014, SpaceX won 9 of the 20 openly competed contracts for delivering stuff to space. They also they were able to massively undercut the United Launch Alliance, which is Boeing, a joint venture between Boeing and the other airline.
Lockheed Martin.
It's a joint venture between them that had been doing a lot of the military contracting for bringing stuff to space, obviously probably spy satellites and all that shit. And SpaceX started winning a lot of those bids just by being way cheaper.
And one of the reasons they're cheaper is that some guys have come up with the notion that you could have a reusable spacecraft in the past, sort of theory crafting, or reusable thrusters. But SpaceX is the first commercially viable company to actually reuse the first stage of their rockets and on the Falcon 9. And they have a second stage that's sacrificial and ends up in space like all the old rockets would. Or actually, it doesn't end up in space, but it dies. I think they might have it eject back down to Earth. But the Starship, which they're developing, will recover all of its component parts, which will drive the cost down even more, which is just pretty incredible because, well, you can watch the videos and watch these rockets land themselves back on their landing pads. And the Starship one, when it does get done, which it's not at the point where they're ready to catch the rocket yet, but when it does get caught, it's going to be caught by the gantry that it launched from, and 2 big chopstick arms, as they call it, which is just going to be an incredible feat of engineering.
Yeah, and I guess the intermediary between the Falcon 9 and the Starship they already have is the Falcon Heavy, which is essentially 3 Falcon 9 boosters configured together. Although they had to do some redesign and rebuilding of the center booster because it has to take quite a bit more pressure and force because it has 2 other boosters strapped to it. So it is a reimagining, but it is essentially 3 Falcon 9 rockets that are strapped in a line and can bring a much bigger payload than the Falcon 9 itself up into orbit. And they can recover all 3 boosters, the center and the 2 side boosters. And the side boosters can land right back at the launch pad, essentially, beside the launch pad, which means it's very cheap because the other one has to get grabbed by a AI robot barge that catches it in the ocean usually, and that's obviously a lot more expensive to have a roving barge pad that catches your rocket rather than it just coming back down to a static place that you can have pre-set up. So that really helps bring the cost down by being able to catch all 3 of them and reuse them. And they were offering discounts on flights all the way back in 2015, 2014 for if you were willing to use a reused, recycled Falcon 9 first stage in your launch for whatever equipment you're sending up. It was a 10% discount. So it's they've it's been a long time in the company's history that they've been building that into the business model.
And the most recent number I saw, which was from 2022, so it's probably gone up a bit, but they had reused their most used first stage 10 times. And it takes about a month for a Falcon 9 first stage to go from being caught to being reused. And the goal with Starship, because Starship will land back at the pad as opposed to the Falcon 9 landing in a barge in the ocean and having to be transported, the Starship, the goal is to be able to reuse in the first stage multiple times a day. And the second stage, I believe, should come back within about a day from when it was launched for the Starship. That's their ideal world. It's pretty incredible.
Well, and maybe I'm misremembering it, but the Starship, the second stage does a rotation of the Earth, does it not?
Yeah, it orbits the Earth once.
And then
at least once. But they've got to be sure to, they've got to iron it out, because at first it might be more than once, but in principle it has to go around the world once in theory.
And then before it comes back down. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But it's pretty incredible, the difference in cost per weight brought up into space, and I was just looking at this. We're not even talking about the potential of the Starship, but the Falcon Heavy, because that one's already operational. It hasn't done I think it's only done 5 successful flights, so it's not that
as of 2022 it had 3, and the big problem sounded like there aren't that many companies that need that much payload.
And so what the numbers I saw for the Falcon Heavy was that for the fully reusable configuration, it would be $100 million to launch a Falcon Heavy, and the payload is 20 to 50 tons in the reusable configuration. And the closest competitor, the closest comparable, is the Delta IV Heavy, and that costs 400 to 600 million to launch and has a maximum payload of 28 tons. And you can also change it around the Falcon Heavy to not be reusable, so that it can carry a lot more weight, because they don't have to conserve any fuel for the landing. And if you full send it, you can get 64 tons, and it costs $200 million. So even if you full send, which is not as economically conservative, you're still looking at 4 times cheaper than the closest peer, and looking at more 6 to 8 times cheaper if you do the reusable setup. Game changer for sure.
The craziest thing with the economics of it is that, by the sounds of it, they will phase out the Falcon 9 and the Falcon Heavy in favor of the Starship, even though the Starship will have a payload of, I believe it's 100 tons reusable, or 150 a maximum if you weren't to reuse parts, in the way you were talking about with the Falcon Heavy. And even though it'll be 100 tons reusable, it'll be cheaper to fly the Starship, is what they're planning, than it would be to fly a Falcon 9, because it's all reusable, which is going to just be a complete game changer if it ends up being the case.
Well, and just for a kind of an interesting taste of what that means is, I was listening to some people talk about the potential in the future, now that the Starship was successfully trialed, and if it gets operational. And there was talks about it's going to basically phase out doing any sort of air courier service between countries. You just send a Starship rather than sending it by plane.
And they also get huge contracts for that, because the U.S. military is incredibly interested in the ability to courier things with spaceships. So they have probably hundreds of millions of dollars of incentive to research that, on top of the potential commercial incentive.
Yeah.
Well,
that was one of the main things I saw. Like, that made me really excited. It's like, man, that would be sweet. I don't have to sit on a plane for 20 hours. Like, eventually. Obviously, that's going to take decades to get there where it's affordable for the regular person, but still, nonetheless. Like, even when I'm well into my golden years, if I could get across the world in a few hours, that would be amazing.
Well, I think the average person would see, though, like the ability to potentially have goods couriered cross planet with Starship at a economical price point.
Mm-hmm.
Like depending on what you're sending, right? Like, you could, obviously it's still going to be expensive, but we're talking. I saw some of the estimates like that were in the low hundreds of dollars per kilo, right? If I remember correctly. And
well, when you're talking 100 tons, yeah, that sounds reasonable.
And so, depending what you're sending, if you're sending something light and valuable, it could actually make sense to send it via Starship for the average person. It might still be expensive, like a couple $100, but depending what you're sending, like,
yeah,
you could send something.
Post recently, like,
yeah, like it would be insane, but like, yeah, you might actually, there might be in the next 10 years feasibly like the ability to send something via, or it might just be like if you're shipping something internationally, you don't even know, but it winds up on a spaceship somehow.
I hadn't even thought of this, but it would also very likely revolutionize industrial activity in the Arctic, because there's poor transportation networks. Like, what I was reading was that instead of sending a probe to Mars, you could just send a whole mining rig and look at what Mars has, a couple kilometers under the surface with a 100-ton payload. But there's nothing stopping them sending that mining rig up into the Arctic and turning that into a gas plant. I don't know how many resources are in the Antarctic.
Yeah, but depending on what is there.
Very inaccessible right now. I mean, with the lessening of the ice caps, one day there'll be a Northwest Passage there. At least I think there has been once in a while during the right seasons already. But yeah, this could be a huge game changer, even to just get remote places. Man, imagine taking a Starship to work.
Well, that's what I was like more saying. It's like, like depending on how much costs actually drop, like you might actually see just instead of taking transatlantic flights, you might be able to take the like a rocket. It's like, okay, I need to get to Japan from North America. Well, instead of taking like a 20-hour flight, or depending on where you're coming from, like you just take a rocket. Like, obviously, I would think that would be many, many decades in the future to get the cost down that low, but that is a possibility. That's definitely one of the articles I was reading was noting that was, I can't remember which company that was one of their goals. It's eventually.
Well, I don't know. I imagine it would be incredibly expensive, as you're saying, for the foreseeable future. But an interesting thing to note with the Starship is that it runs on methane. One of the reasons being that methane burns cleaner than kerosene, which is a common jet fuel. And so it doesn't foul the engine as much that you're going to reuse. But another aspect of running on methane for the Starship is that when they go to Mars, they'll be able to do industrial chemistry on Mars to produce methane and oxygen in order to refuel the Starship for return to Earth.
Can you, Rudo?
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Like,
could you get her out? She's scratching the door and scratching the table.
Starship is around $200 estimated per kilo. And
just amazing.
Falcon Heavy.
Sorry, how much was it?
Already $200 per kilo into space, and Falcon Heavy is around $1,600 already, which is already functional. And if you're just looking at like what else has been sent, like the Delta Heavy that we were referencing before, which was the peer competitor, it averages 12,800. So it's already like Falcon Heavy's already made it like nearly a order of magnitude cheaper. and then Starship will make it almost nearly another order of magnitude cheaper. So you're talking like closing in on like 1/100th of the cost.
What's the total cost of launching a Starship? Do you see that, or
no? But I mean, you can do the math.
Oh man, math with tons though. Sheesh.
Well, I'm pretty sure because it's science. They use metric tons. So it's 1,000,000 times 200. So I think 200 million would be the rough estimate. $200 million to launch a Starship.
Yeah, because what I was seeing for estimates on if you wanted to pack a large crew in there, like your goal was to pack humans in a feasible, usable space, because there's only so much space and humans aren't able to just be stacked. Unless you look at a one diagram of the guy who was theorizing about the slave ship. But I don't think people are going to pay thousands of dollars to fly like that. But if you had 100 people in a $200 million flight, that's not affordable, but you can definitely see how space tourism would be in the realm of possibility, or space flight, for a lot more people than it is right now.
Yeah, 2 million per flight. You'd have a ton of like rich adventurers that would be able to do that.
Yeah,
like that's definitely, there's thousands or tens of thousands of people that's quote unquote affordable for, right? Like it's really not that crazy for the world's wealthy.
Yeah, like instead of buying a private jet, or well, not even a private jet, but in the ballpark of something very expensive purchase, instead you go on a spaceship. I mean,
instead of buying a cheap summer home,
yeah,
for one of those people, instead of adding to one of their many properties, you could do a space flight instead. Yeah, it's very doable for, like I said, the very wealthy. Like, because I think that's worth, like, it is worth potentially contrasting against that, like, because there has been that, like I was talking about before, the Space Adventures company, and they actually just brought people to the International Space Station. So when they would send up crews to the International Space Station on Russian missions, they'd bring a tourist with them. Basically, was the strategy.
That's honestly such a vibe. Just going up there with the Russian boys, like.
So they would have, I think it was generally like 2 or 3 crew, and then they'd have one tourist. And the tourist paid between $35 and $20 million a ticket, depending. And this was back in like 2001 to 2009 when this was in its heyday.
Just the Russian oligarchs.
So you're talking like back then, that would have been like, in today's money, that's like $30 to $50 million, $30 to $60 million a ticket, right? So again, $2 million, much more. Like, there's very few people that can afford a $50 million ticket. $2 million, again, like, brings it down an order of magnitude or two, and it's like much more affordable. But that is pretty cool that they had just one random person coming up to the space station, and they did in 2021, which was like their only recent mission. They brought 2 Japanese tourists on the same mission to the International Space Station, and they usually stay for several days, and I think like 7 or 8 days, and then go back. And they also at one point advertised spacewalks. So it would be an extra $15 million add-on to your ticket, and you get to walk in space, but no one bought it. So
I think everybody was a little bit too.
I think I was too scared.
Yeah.
You're risk-taking $15 million, and you get to walk in space. Just sounds like a bad risk-taking proposition.
Yeah.
It's like these astronauts have trained for years, decades, in order to do spacewalks, and it's like, I'm a tourist. I'll hit it up.
It's like that one uncle that always does like something way outside their skill level.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, we'll take you on the spacewalk, but we have to hold your hand the whole time. That's what the contract says. We'll put you on a leash. I'm pretty sure they all have leashes.
I think you could see like the advent of a much bigger kind of space station, permanent space station in space, because it's much easier to bring the quantity of stuff up there, right?
I would imagine. I was looking at the next space station that the NASA wants, because what NASA wants to do is promote commercial ventures to create space stations, and then they'll provide contracts for them to carry things out on those space stations rather than run something like the ISS again. Because basically NASA spends $3.5 billion a year running the ISS, and I think other countries also contribute somewhat to that. But there's a private company that's received funding from NASA that will build its space station attached to the ISS, and then once it's complete, will detach. And they figure they'll build their space station for $3 billion. So it'll cost them less to build a space station with double the capacity of the ISS than it spends to keep the ISS in space for a year. And I'd imagine that their cost calculations are done with something like Starship.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense.
The ISS took 40 launches to assemble, and they say they can make their space station with 8 or 9 launches. So whatever they're budgeting to use has incredible capacity compared to what the ISS was built with.
Well, incredible capacity, and also the each flight is probably cheaper, right?
Yeah.
So it's like less flights and cheaper flights, and yeah, there you go. Like that's just obviously.
Well, it also makes it viable for what the strategy is. It sounds like with Starship, is to launch the Starship into orbit with all the materials, and then what it sounded like to me is that they would then launch the astronauts into orbit on a second Starship mission, and then they would launch multiple Starship missions, depending on the scope, up to 14 refueling missions to refuel the first Starship in space. And then that would go on a mission basically anywhere in the solar system, because you now have a fully fueled Starship in space. And that would be, well, if we're saying it was a 200 million a flight, so if you had to do 14 fueling missions and 2 initial missions, like that would still only end up being 3 billion, 3.2 billion, which is like, that's for space agencies, that's like a fairly normal cost of doing business for a lot of missions.
That's like a weekend in Ukraine. I mean,
yeah.
Oh, that's a really interesting part that came up when I was looking this up, is the effect of Starlink in Ukraine, because the Ukrainian military has been using it, subsidized by good old Elon Musk. Elon Musk, apparently, he was upset that he was the one having to subsidize the Starlink, but there was so much public backlash so that he just kept subsidizing it rather than, make Ukraine pay the bill. So it's cost him like $100 million of SpaceX's money, I'd imagine, to have Ukraine use Starlink. And they are arguing with Ukraine about not allowing Ukraine to use Starlink to conduct offensive operations. I believe they don't want that to happen because they think it'd be bad PR. But the Russians have not been able to block Starlink with hacking or interference. And having more than 10,000 satellites means you can't shoot them down. I think the only option I saw that the Russians could do would be to EMP space in general, like just launch some nukes up there and blow them up and knock out every satellite, which is, the Russians barely have functional satellite systems as it is. So
yeah, it's not like they'd lose a lot.
I was gonna say, this sounds like a shitty fucking 90s B movie plot. Like, oh, we're gonna nuke space, guys.
Yeah. And
well, knowing, given how Russia's performed thus far and what they've done, it's like, might actually,
but they're
not be unrealistic
with SpaceX and these Starlink satellites, because they did a very similar operation much more successfully in Georgia, if anybody remembers that, where Russia invaded Georgia, it kind of reached the capital and then was like, okay, now you're a bitch. But when they did that, they knocked out all the cell towers, they knocked out the internet, they knocked out all forms of communication. So they jammed the radios, so the Georgian military couldn't talk to each other. But in Ukraine, they've never managed to successfully knock out any communication because of Starlink, or any substantial amount of communication. And also, previous military satellite communication was restricted to sort of the high command because you only had so many satellites. but the bandwidth on Starlink and the ease of transportation just means like a random truck can just have a Starlink on top of it, and some privates and maybe a sergeant are just bullshitting on the internet or like live streaming whatever they want to high command, because you just have unlimited bandwidth and nobody has to worry about, oh, this channel only can handle this much stuff, so it has to be restricted to the upper echelons.
I was gonna say, nobody remembers Georgia because it was before we had Twitter bios with flags in them.
That's true. Yeah. I remember Georgia because it was formative years. Speaking of which, I should know what year it was, but late 2000s.
Yeah, 2008.
I'm pretty sure.
It definitely also got overshadowed by the housing crisis, I'm sure, in most people's minds.
Yeah, that is like Starlink is a whole other like rabbit hole that you could go down, but it is pretty impressive how quickly that got deployed, and thanks to the ability to send up rockets easily.
It sounds like in the same vein as GPS, now Europe, Russia, and China all want their own version of Starlink for military purposes. And I'd imagine in the same vein as GPS, what the Russians do is going to be complete hot garbage unless they work with the Chinese. But I imagine they will work with the Chinese and they'll deploy a big constellation in a similar fashion.
Yeah, I'd assume that's coming. I mean, Starlink already does contracts out with the military, so I'm sure there's a bunch of other interesting things that have been sent up for like that we don't know about yet, or maybe we'll never know about.
Hunter killer satellites to take down the other constellations.
I think the only thing like holding back Starlink from being completely ubiquitous across the surface of the Earth is the ground stations, as far as I know, because you need some sort of ground link system, and that's like at least in Canada, like parts of Canada aren't covered because the ground stations aren't in yet. It's not the satellite. The satellite deployment is not the issue. It's the ground stations at this point is the bottleneck, as far as I can tell.
Last time I looked into it, because they have to basically make a continuous, because they're low Earth orbit, so they're constantly going around the globe. They have to make like a continuous string of satellites. So when I had last looked into it, it depended on where that string was, whether or not you got service, as well as what you're talking about, the ground stations. I haven't read as to whether or not they finally covered the whole globe with strings of satellites, but I wouldn't be surprised at this point. We have so many up there.
Yeah, it actually is quite incredible.
Canada has the most potential for being benefited by Starlink, I would say, simply because our existing telecommunications are so expensive that, say, in an actual city with wired internet connection, you're paying $110 a month for the plan that Starlink would offer you for $150, and that Starlink plan would work anywhere in Canada, or almost anywhere in Canada.
Yeah, Canada is definitely a contender, also with like the large rural population, large-ish. I guess the U.S. is also another contender. Like people don't. I think Canadians maybe underestimate it, but there's a lot of Americans that live rural or semi-rural, and also America's internet systems, like America's wired systems, like their network sucks giant donkey balls.
Yeah,
like,
it does.
It's if you're outside of like the major metros, it's probably worse in every way, as far as I can tell, except for places that have Google Fiber, from what I've heard or seen.
Well, our Canadian government spends billions of taxpayer money on upgrading internet to rural locations that service maybe a couple hundred people even. So I can see us having a better fiber connection.
Well, it's just like even in like relatively large cities, like a lot of Americans will just like complain about not having access to fiber or even like high speed. They're still on like 5 megabit DSL or some shit, and it's like Jesus Christ. Like America is like pretty scuffed in certain respects that even Canadians just like don't realize. Like you're just like, wow.
That is pretty rough, because living in relatively rural, middle of nowhere Canada, we've had fiber access for 2 years.
and like decent fiber. It's not like amazing or anything, but it's like fairly reliable and fairly fast. And yeah, like the US, there's like actual towns that just don't have that reliable. Like you're stuck on like some shitty DSL for, under 100 megabits a second. Like, okay, fun. And it's expensive too. They also have the problem with like there'll only be one service provider in the area, and then they'll just charge you $100 a month for shitty crash. So it's like similar to Canada. so Starlink,
there's a huge market in America too, is what you're saying.
I'm saying that it's probably like proportionally bigger, and obviously just because America's bigger in absolute terms, like America's going to be a huge benefactor of Starlink.
Interesting.
And I don't know, it'll be interesting. And Starlink also charges everything in USD, so definitely worth. Yeah, Americans definitely have it. And the competition itself is just worth it, right? Like,
like to have something else alongside of the fiber providers.
And it's only like Price was saying before. There's under 10,000 under 10,000 satellites now, and they're trying to get regulatory approval for 40,000. So it's only going to get better and more reliable and faster and everything, right? So it's just
especially after they start launching more through Starship.
Well, that's what I was going to say. It's all going to be cheaper and easier to maintain now that they have better launch systems, ever more reliable and cheaper launch systems.
Imagine the competitors are going to have to, well, for the near future, they're probably going to have to go to SpaceX in order to launch their satellite constellations if they want to be cost competitive with Starlink. That'll be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, good luck. That's all.
We've got 1,000 satellites we want to put in a Starship. You can launch that up for us?
Basically cornered the market.
I don't know what the rules would. Yeah, I'm assuming Starship would have some sort of obligation to. I don't know.
Probably get sued for anti-competitive practices if they didn't, but it'll be interesting to see when it happens, because I'm sure it will happen.
That's their first mission failure in a long time.
Yeah.
Oh, we just don't know what happened. It's crazy.
It's absolutely insane. It just like blew up. Like, we do not know it. Well, I mean, it was an empty tin can that blew up. We didn't actually put any of our expensive.
Any of our expensive
instead of stainless steel, this was made of pop can aluminum.
That's one way to go about it. I don't know. Do you guys have any other specific topics on the space race you want to hit on?
SpaceX basically won.
Well, that's what I learned. Could touch specifically on the explosion of the spaceship or Starship test, because that was disingenuously reported by a lot of media. I believe it's clickbait, and probably because they hate Musk too. But when the Starship blew up, by all accounts, it was a successful test flight. Yeah,
the SpaceX's main condition, like a major failure, if it blew up on the pad and wrecked their launch equipment. I think that was what they said. Like that, like if they could get it even just a little ways up, that was already a success, like as defined by them.
Past the point of maximum
forces. Yeah, exactly.
On the rocket.
I was listening to an interview about it, and that's a huge deal.
Yeah, no, entire rocket was sacrificial because they didn't want to risk attempting a landing on something that they hadn't even proven could fly.
Yeah, exactly.
And wrecking their launch base.
Yeah,
as you were saying, that was their failure condition, and they did not fail. And they achieved pretty much as they could reasonably have expected to achieve. Like, you can have better test flights than they had, where it doesn't explode, and you get further. But, like, that's a pipe dream when it comes to
exactly. It's like, it's not something that they're even really hoping for. It's like they were just looking for getting it off the pad, hopefully hitting max G, but even max G would have been like a pretty big win, right? And they got that. So generally speaking, it was a huge success. But when I looked that up, because I was looking up that article because I'd heard that it had launched, I was like, oh, let's get some more information about this. Most of the articles I saw were just like, SpaceX blew up their spaceship, like, haha, what fucking morons. That was like the general attitude towards it. I'm like, that does not seem appropriate, like, given like the fact that SpaceX had already laid out, like, you can just go see what they said about like what their success was considered prior to even launching, right? So it's not like they're, managing their goals from in post, right? Like they had already stated that. It was very odd. It really does seem like you said, Price, clickbait and just an absolute disdain for Musk.
Yeah, and I mean the average person doesn't really care about, what SpaceX's win conditions are or success conditions. Let's not be as nerdy. And they're just seeing a rocket blow up in the sky, and they think that looks cool, and they clicked on it to see that.
Yeah. Well, and
Musk, that applies to that I thought was really good is that if things are not failing, you aren't innovating enough. It's like that's the attitude that got SpaceX to the point they're at.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's how these tests are done. Like people see I don't know what is going on with the mainstream media other than just being a bunch of morons, but that's how SpaceX has been doing it since the beginning, right? It's like they've blown up so many different rockets, and that was always like the accepted way that they were going to innovate was, okay, we're going to lose a bunch of these damn things. Yeah, exactly. It's like, I can't imagine how many things NASA blew up.
Astronauts in them.
Yeah, exactly. Like NASA has lost a lot of shit. Like, obviously there's like the manned ones. Yeah. Those ones are different, but like their innovation too was gonna break shit on the pad and whatnot. Like it's not like any explosion is a failure. Like all the companies lose shit. It's just it was bizarre.
Is like the other space, like NASA, with their stuff that had all been safety tested and everything, still had one explode on the pad. So like. Getting off the pad and achieving things with your first test flight is a huge success, basically.
Yeah,
I do think it's interesting, just like how little coverage, like the SpaceX, like until I started looking into SpaceX for this, I had known that they were like doing some stuff and they were like doing reasonably well or whatever. Like, but then you go and look at it and it's like they are absolutely crushing it, and they've like achieved like one significant milestone after another that is just like completely outside of what I think everyone expected for their company when it was founded. Just like it's like crushing it essentially. And I mean that's even reflected in the valuations it gets. It's cracked $100 billion valuation as a company, and it's privately held, and like everyone is so positive on the company from that, like that actually covers it. And it's like, you don't see any of this stuff in the news. Like I never even knew like that they had, like, if you had asked me how many successful launches into space that SpaceX had, like before I started researching this, I probably would have been like, I don't know, 10. It's like, no, they have like over 200.
Well, I think I remember it being like a lot more covered, but that was prior to Musk becoming somebody like, person non grata, right? Like persona non grata. It seems like with the change in, I would say, like, I don't know what the term would be, but like elitist turn against him, like you don't like see much of it at all. Could be for different reasons, but that's kind of what it feels like to me.
I would agree that I'd seen some coverage of it, and I knew that SpaceX was kind of the big game in town for launching rockets these days. Like competing with the Russians was what I had thought of. And before researching this headspace, it was like the Russians were the big launchers and SpaceX was like the American underdog coming to take them on and, outcompete them on economics by reusing a rocket, or at the very least compete with the economics that they have to spend more for safety being American. But then, reading this, it's like nobody gave me the impression that they were making basically a complete a qualitative change in space flight and orders of magnitude change in economics of space flight. Like leaps like this just don't happen in many times in history.
Yeah, it's incredible. Like it really is. Like once you actually look into it, because I had the same impression where it's like, yeah, this is a big deal and the engineering's quite amazing, but it's like, no, this is it's a phase change.
Yeah, everyone in the space race and anyone who wants to launch anything into space has to respond to SpaceX now.
Yeah,
SpaceX seems to be years ahead of the competition.
The one company that I came across that seems really interesting, that like depending on how well they do and how organized and how much progress they can make in the next few years, that seems like they might be able to take a crack at it, is the relativity space, and it's 3D printing the rockets, and they just had a successful launch pretty recently where they got it off the pad and everything, like by like their own metrics, like it was a success. And so because it's 3D printed, like there's potential to like further decrease the cost of rocketry by like another order of magnitude. So if if SpaceX then gets into that as well, or if this company winds up really being able to massively advance their ability to land the rockets too, so they can even reuse that, or at least big components of it, you could wind up seeing another order of magnitude step down in cost, which would be pretty wild.
I'm a little suspicious on the 3D printing stuff just because I'm certain SpaceX uses metal 3D printing for components that need metal 3D printing. And
this company's looking to do, the one that they launched was 85% of the vehicles 3D printed, and they're looking to get it up to 95%, which is...
I'm suspicious that numbers that high, you start to lose the economy of 3D printing, because there are certain things that can be 3D printed that cannot be produced in any other fashion, or at the very least can't be produced in as lightweight a way as the 3D printing allows, which is why metal 3D printing is huge in aerospace, the entire aerospace industry. But the body and large tubes, stuff like that is just metal. It does not need to be 3D printed, right? When you're trying to push the number as high as you can, it just seems a little suspicious as more of a marketing thing to get it that high.
They need to throw some AI buzzwords into their marketing. They need to, we 3D print spaceships.
3D printing is revolutionizing revolutionizing the wrong word. It's iterating and making aerospace stuff lighter and more efficient. But to say it's revolutionary seems like kind of a stretch. We'll
have to wait and see. But it's
being huge, but I don't see how it would work out.
Well, I'm not a rocket engineer, so we're a fucking materials engineer, so I cannot comment on it. But to me, it does seem it's good to have another company throwing their hat in the ring, trying something else, and maybe it's going to be flash in the pan and really doesn't mean anything. But you never know, right? Everybody said that you can't land rockets. You can't reuse them. That's what everybody told Musk. You're full of fucking shit.
That was not what everybody told Musk, because there had been people who had theorized it. People may have told Musk that, but there were...
Yeah, he was really up against... even Buzz Aldrin said he was Buzz Aldrin basically called him an idiot.
Buzz Aldrin's an astronaut. He's not a rocket scientist. Or he might be, actually.
Yeah, I actually don't know what his education is, but
he's definitely an engineer of some fashion.
Yeah, typically astronauts are generally also intelligent.
Oh yeah, they're definitely intelligent. But it's just, it was a change because no one had done it before. But it's not that no one had thought of it. It's just, Musk was the first person to actually take that idea and say, we're going to do it and make it work.
Well, to be fair, that is that's 95% of the hard part. You know what I mean? Theorizing is very easy, and that's kind of Musk's strength, right? Is
actual product design and production.
Electric vehicles have been built commercially, decades before Musk came along. And it's just they had never gotten traction and never like
well, that's one of the things that he said. He's like, the prototypes are easy, production is the hard part.
If you want to get pedantic, the first vehicles were electric, and then they realized internal combustion was way better than just trying to use batteries.
Yes, but I mean, in terms of like modern landscape of automobile, and you had whatever GM, I think it was GM that had like an actual production model of electric. In like
I can't remember what that
80s.
car was called. It was in the 90s, and then they just stopped making it. Yeah, that was really well liked. Fuck, what was that thing called?
Like, so there has been like plenty of examples of things that are, there's the idea is there, and even like the prototype or production is there. It's just like the getting things scaled and sold and commercially viable is the hard part.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good distinction to make, that that's kind of seems to be his genius, is in getting stuff done. It's like, I feel like Steve Jobs is an example of a guy that like pushed the limit on, where ideas can take you. He had those ideas about what consumers wanted, and he was brilliant at it. But I think that's about all I've got for space stuff now.
Yeah. Robert, you got anything else?
No, that's about it.
All right. Well, that's it for me. Thanks for listening, everybody. Peace.
Peace.
Peace.